The day Gary Eun-Woo forgot how to breathe, he wasn't being strangled or suffocated. He was standing in the doorway of his own estate's sitting room, holding a brass screwdriver, staring at a woman in gold who looked like she'd stepped out of a painting he didn't know existed. The gears of his heart stopped. The rhythms he'd relied on for 32 years stuttered into silence. And for the first time in his meticulously ordered life, Gary understood what people meant when they said time could stop. 6 months earlier, Gary had been exactly where he wanted to be, alone. The Eun-Woo estate sat on 3 acres in Pyeongchang-dong, surrounded by walls so high that delivery drivers often joked they were dropping packages at a fortress. The main house was a sprawling Hanok renovation, all dark wood and curved tiles, with a modern glass wing Gary had added specifically to house his workshop. Most people in the neighborhood had never seen inside. Most people had never seen Gary, either, except as a shadow behind tinted car windows or a figure disappearing through the iron gates at odd hours. The rumors started small. A man that young, living alone in a house that size, driving cars with windows you couldn't see through, it bred speculation. Then someone noticed the security cameras. Then someone else saw what looked like a meeting, 3 black sedans parked in formation at 2 in the morning. Never mind that it was a shipment of vintage watch parts from Switzerland and the meeting was Gary signing for insured cargo. The neighborhood had already decided. Gary Eun-Woo was Yakuza. Or worse. Definitely dangerous. Gary found this useful. When you were suspected of criminal enterprise, people didn't try to set you up on blind dates. They didn't ask you to neighborhood association meetings. They didn't knock on your door with homemade kimchi and questions about why a successful young man wasn't married yet. The myth gave him exactly what he craved: distance. The truth was far less cinematic. Gary had inherited the estate from his grandfather, a man who'd made his fortune in textile manufacturing and had the good sense to invest in sole real estate in the 1970s. Gary's own wealth came from a different kind of precision. He was one of Korea's most sought-after master watchmakers, though few knew his face. He worked exclusively on commission, restoring pieces that museums and collectors considered impossible. A 1910 Patek Philippe that hadn't run in decades. A prototype Seiko from the 1960s that only 3 people in the world knew how to service. Work that required a microscope, tweezers finer than human hair, and the ability to hold your breath for minutes at a time. Gary was very good at holding his breath. He was less good at everything else. Conversations felt like trying to assemble a watch without instructions, each word a component that never quite fit the way it should. Eye contact was a physical discomfort, like staring into a bright light. The expected rhythms of social interaction, the pauses, the laughter, the inexplicable moments when people seemed to communicate without words, remained a language he'd never learned. As a child, he'd been labeled difficult, then strange, then finally gifted when his talent with mechanical objects became impossible to ignore. His parents, both academics who valued achievement over warmth, had been relieved to have a category for him. His grandfather had been the only one who understood that Gary didn't need fixing. He needed space. So Gary had built himself a life of carefully controlled solitude. He woke at 5. He worked until his hands cramped. He ate when he remembered. He had no friends, and he'd never had a girlfriend. The few times well-meaning relatives had arranged introductions, the women had left looking either bored or unnerved. Gary told himself he didn't mind. Attraction was another mechanism he'd never felt the gears of, another part of human experience that seemed to function in everyone but him. He had his work. He had his silence. He had his walls. Then his housekeeper retired. Mrs. Cho had been with the family for 40 years, a woman in her 70s who'd known Gary since he was a child and had the good sense to leave him alone. She cooked, cleaned, and asked no questions. When she announced she was moving to Busan to live with her daughter, Gary felt something close to panic. The thought of interviewing replacements, of explaining his routines to a stranger, of having someone new violating the carefully maintained ecosystem of his space, it was intolerable. "You need someone," Mrs. Cho said firmly, packing the last of her belongings into boxes. "You'll starve or disappear into that workshop and forget you're human. I'll hire a cleaning service. Meal delivery. You need a person, Eun-Woo SSI. Someone who'll make sure you don't kill yourself with neglect. She paused, then added with the bluntness of someone who'd earned it, I already found someone. She starts Monday. Gary opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Mrs. Cho had never steered him wrong. If she trusted someone, perhaps he could too. Who? A young woman. Nigerian. Very practical. She won't bother you with nonsense. Nigerian. Gary turned the word over in his mind. He'd never met anyone from Nigeria. He'd barely met anyone from outside Korea, except the Swiss horologists he occasionally consulted with by video call. The thought made him uneasy, but Mrs. Cho was already walking away, her decision made. Nancy Ade arrived on a Monday morning in March, carrying 2 suitcases and an expression of grim determination. Gary watched from his workshop window as she stood at the gate, pressing the intercom button with the efficiency of someone who'd already decided this job was temporary and she'd be damned if she'd let that show. She was tall, taller than he'd expected, with dark skin that seemed to absorb the spring sunlight and hair pulled back into a sleek bun. She wore dark jeans and a practical jacket, and when the gate buzzed open, she walked up the drive with her shoulders back like she was entering a business negotiation, not a job she'd probably been warned was strange at best and dangerous at worst. Gary had left instructions with the security system to let her in. He had no intention of greeting her personally. Social niceties were Mrs. Cho's department, and Mrs. Cho was gone, so logically there was no need for him to interrupt his work for introductions. He'd leave a note. She'd figure it out. He lasted 20 minutes before curiosity dragged him out of the workshop. He found her in the kitchen, efficiently unpacking groceries she'd apparently brought herself, arranging them in the refrigerator with the kind of systematic precision that made something in Gary's chest a knot slightly. She'd already located the inventory list Mrs. Cho had left, and she was checking items off with a pen, muttering to herself in what sounded like a mixture of Korean and something else. The rice cooker is in the lower cabinet, Gary said from the doorway. Nancy didn't jump. She turned, looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to the groceries. Found it. Also found 3 different sets of fine china and 0 everyday dishes. We'll fix that. Her Korean was good, only slightly accented, with a directness that caught him off guard. Most people approached him carefully, like he might detonate. She was arranging vegetables like he wasn't there. I don't entertain, Gary said. I noticed. You also don't seem to eat anything that isn't instant or delivered. Mrs. Cho left me notes. You have the diet of a university student and the kitchen of a hotel. I've been busy. You're always busy. That's not an excuse to treat your body like a machine. She closed the refrigerator and finally looked at him properly. Her eyes were dark, direct, and completely free of the nervous energy most people brought into his presence. I'm Nancy. Mrs. Cho hired me to keep you from accidentally starving to death in your workshop. I cook, clean, manage the house, and I don't do unnecessary conversation. We should get along fine. Gary felt something shift. It wasn't attraction. He wouldn't have recognized attraction if it introduced itself with a formal bow. It was relief. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't impressed by him. She was treating this like a job, which meant she understood boundaries. Gary, he said, though she obviously knew. I work unusual hours. I'm often in the workshop for days at a time. I don't like interruptions. Mrs. Cho mentioned. I'll leave meals outside the workshop door. You'll eat them, or I'll come in and make you eat them, and neither of us wants that. You can't come into the workshop. Then eat the meals. It was the most efficient negotiation Gary had ever conducted. He nodded once and left. Neurodivergence, particularly traits associated with autism spectrum conditions, often manifests as heightened focus on specific interests, difficulty with social reciprocity, and preference for routine and solitude. Gary's characterization reflects high-functioning autism, where exceptional skill in narrow domains coexists with challenges in social-emotional processing. This isn't deficit but difference, a neurological variation present in roughly 1 to 2% of the population, though often underdiagnosed in adults. Over the following weeks, they developed a rhythm. Nancy ran the estate with quiet confidence, appearing when necessary and vanishing when not. She left meals on a tray outside his workshop door, always balanced, always on time, always with a small note in surprisingly neat handwriting: "Eat this, or I'm coming in." Gary ate them. The food was unlike anything Mrs. Cho had made, rich with spices and flavors he couldn't name, but substantial in a way that made him realize he'd been half-starving himself for years. She never knocked unless it was urgent. She never tried to make small talk when they passed in the halls. She treated the estate like a machine that needed maintenance, and Gary like a component that required specific handling. It should have felt cold. Instead, it felt like the first time in his life someone had read the manual. But Gary noticed things. He couldn't help it. Noticing was what he did. He noticed that Nancy kept her door closed but not locked, and that late at night, light spilled from under it while she listened to video lectures in English. He noticed that she wore silver earrings every day, small hoops that caught the light, and that she changed them on Sundays. He noticed that she sang sometimes while she worked, soft melodies in a language he didn't recognize, and that she stopped immediately if she thought he might hear. He noticed that the neighborhood had noticed her. The first incident happened in week 3. Gary was returning from a rare supply run, pulling his sedan through the gate, when he saw Mrs. Kang from 2 houses down standing on the sidewalk, staring at the estate with her phone raised. She lowered it quickly when she saw him, but not quickly enough. That evening, Nancy knocked on his workshop door. Actually knocked. 3 sharp raps that meant something was wrong. "Come in," Gary said, before remembering he'd told her never to come in. She opened the door but didn't cross the threshold. "The police came today." Gary's hands stilled on the watch movement he'd been adjusting. "Why?" "Wellness check. Someone called and said they were concerned about a foreign woman living in a house with a known criminal." Her voice was flat, but her jaw was tight. "I showed them my visa, my employment contract, and explained that you're a watchmaker, not a mob boss. They seemed disappointed." "I'm sorry," Gary said, and meant it. "It's not your fault people are stupid." She paused. "But you should know it's probably going to happen again. Mrs. Cho warned me. She said the neighborhood has an active imagination. Do you want to leave?" The question surprised them both. Gary hadn't meant to ask. Logically, it made sense to confirm her intentions. Emotionally, and Gary tried very hard not to think in emotional terms, the thought of her leaving created a small, uncomfortable pressure in his chest. Nancy studied him for a long moment. "Do you want me to leave?" "No." "Then I'm staying. I've dealt with worse than nosy neighbors and bored police." She turned to go, then stopped. "Mrs. Cho also told me something else. She said you're a good person who gets mistaken for a bad one because you don't perform the right way. She said I should ignore everyone else and just watch what you do, not what they say about you." Gary didn't know what to say to that. Nancy didn't wait for a response. She closed the door, and Gary sat in the ensuing silence, staring at the tiny gears scattered across his desk, thinking about performance and perception and the unfairness of being judged by standards you'd never agreed to. He thought about Nancy facing police officers alone because people had decided he was dangerous. He thought about her staying anyway. The next morning, he left a note with her breakfast tray. "Thank you for staying." When he retrieved the empty tray that evening, she'd written underneath, "Thank you for the quiet." Spring turned to summer. The azaleas bloomed and faded. Gary completed a restoration on a 1950s Omega that a museum in Paris had declared unsalvageable, and the client sent a payment large enough that Gary didn't have to take another commission for 6 months if he didn't want to. He wanted to. Work was the only thing that made sense. Except now there was Nancy. She'd become part of the estate's ecosystem, moving through the spaces with the same unobtrusive efficiency as air or light. But Gary found himself aware of her in ways he'd never been aware of another person. He knew her schedule better than his own. He knew she woke at 6 and ran the perimeter of the estate for exactly 30 minutes. He knew she video-called her family in Lagos every Sunday evening, speaking in rapid English punctuated by laughter that made something in Gary's chest feel strange and tight. He knew she was studying, though for what, he didn't know. He told himself it was simple observation. Pattern recognition. He noticed things about his watches too, the particular tick of a balance wheel, the microscopic wear on a jewel bearing. This was no different. Except it was different, and Gary knew it, and he didn't know what to do with the knowledge. The afternoon everything changed started like any other. Gary was in his workshop, working on a complex minute repeater mechanism that required absolute silence to properly calibrate. He'd been at it for 6 hours, and his shoulders ached, but he was close to breakthrough. Just one more adjustment. Then he realized he couldn't find his precision screwdriver. It was a small thing, a tool he'd had for 15 years, perfectly balanced and irreplaceable. He checked his workbench, his tool drawers, the floor. Nothing. Growing frustration turned to genuine distress. He needed that screwdriver. The work couldn't continue without it. He'd had it this morning, he was certain, but then Nancy had brought lunch and he'd eaten in the workshop for once instead of ignoring the tray, and had he left it in the sitting room? Gary didn't go into the sitting room. It was Nancy's domain, the space where she managed the household accounts and took her video calls. But he might have walked through there this morning, distracted, carrying tools he shouldn't have been carrying outside the workshop. He stood, joints protesting after hours of stillness, and walked through the house to the sitting room. The door was half open. Sunlight poured through the windows. And Nancy stood in the center of the room, transformed. Gary stopped breathing. She wore a dress unlike anything he'd ever seen, floor-length and brilliant, geometric patterns in gold and orange and deep red that seemed to move with her even though she was standing still. The fabric wrapped around her body in structured folds, emphasizing the strong line of her shoulders and the elegant length of her neck. But it was her head that made Gary's heart forget how to beat. She wore something towering and intricate, fabric wrapped and folded into a sculptural crown that added inches to her height and transformed her into something regal, something that belonged in a museum or a palace. Not in his sitting room on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She was looking at a laptop screen, laughing at something someone was saying, and the afternoon light caught her skin and turned it to burnished bronze. And Gary realized with a clarity that felt like falling that he'd never understood what beautiful meant before this exact moment. She turned slightly, saw him standing in the doorway, and her smile faltered. "Gary," she said, and her voice sounded different, richer, like the dress had changed something fundamental. "I'm sorry, I should have asked. Today is my sister's wedding. I'm attending by video. I can move to my room." "No," Gary said, and his voice came out strange, rough. "Don't." Nancy's eyes widened slightly. On the laptop screen, voices called out in what Gary assumed was her language, but Nancy held up one finger in a wait gesture, her attention fixed on him. "Are you all right?" she asked. Gary was not all right. Every carefully constructed system in his brain was malfunctioning. He'd spent 32 years operating on logic and precision, and now he was standing in his own house, holding a screwdriver he'd apparently been carrying the whole time, staring at his estate manager like a broken automaton. And he couldn't form words because his entire understanding of himself had just shattered. He wasn't broken. He wasn't incapable of attraction. He'd just been waiting for her. "You look," Gary started, then stopped, because he didn't have words for what she looked like, and every phrase that came to mind seemed inadequate, seemed like it would reduce something extraordinary to something common. Nancy waited, patient, and on the laptop someone whistled and said something teasing that made Nancy's cheeks darken. "I'll leave you to the wedding," Gary managed finally. "I'm sorry for interrupting." He turned and walked back to his workshop on legs that didn't feel entirely stable, closed the door, and stood there in the familiar smell of machine oil and metal, trying to understand what had just happened to him. The precision screwdriver was still in his hand. He'd been carrying it the whole time. Gary set it down carefully on his workbench, then sat in his chair and stared at his hands. They were shaking. His hands never shook. Steady hands were essential for his work, and his had been reliable for decades, and now they trembled like faulty mechanisms. And it was because of a woman in gold who'd been living in his house for 4 months, and he'd been too carefully controlled to notice that everything had already changed. That night, Gary didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind running through the same calculations over and over, trying to categorize what he'd felt, trying to fit it into a framework that made sense. Attraction was supposed to be a gradual thing, wasn't it? An accumulation of compatible traits and proximity and shared interests. It wasn't supposed to hit like a hammer, instantaneous and total, triggered by sunlight and fabric and the particular angle of a woman's neck. But maybe he'd been feeling it all along and simply hadn't recognized the signs. Maybe the awareness of her schedule, the attention to her small habits, the relief he felt when he heard her moving through the house, maybe those had been attraction, and he'd been too inexperienced to name it. The thought terrified him. Gary had built his life on predictability. Variables he could control. And this, whatever this was, felt like chaos. Worse, it felt vulnerable. The few times he'd tried to connect with people, he'd failed so completely that he'd stopped trying. Nancy had stayed because she didn't want connection. She'd been explicit about it. She valued the quiet, the distance, the professional boundary between them. If he changed that, if he reached for something more and she recoiled, he wouldn't just lose whatever this was. He'd lose her entirely. She'd leave, like everyone eventually left when they realized Gary didn't know how to be what they needed, and he'd be alone again in his too large house with only his watches for company. The safe thing, the logical thing, was to do nothing. Maintain the status quo. Bury this feeling like he'd buried every other uncomfortable emotion in his life, and let it fade from neglect. But the image of her in that dress wouldn't leave his mind. The way she'd smiled at the laptop, unguarded and joyful. The way she'd looked at him when she noticed him watching, a flicker of something he couldn't name crossing her face before concern took over. At 4 a.m, Gary gave up on sleep and went to his workshop. Work had always been his refuge. Work made sense. He picked up the minute repeater he'd been calibrating and tried to focus. The mechanism was delicate, beautiful, a symphony of tiny components working in perfect harmony to chime the hours and quarters when activated. It was the kind of work that usually absorbed him completely, but his hands were still unsteady, and after 20 minutes, he had to stop before he damaged something irreplaceable. Gary set down his tools and pressed his palms flat against the workbench, breathing carefully. He was 32 years old. He'd never had a crush, never experienced infatuation, never felt the particular cocktail of longing and terror that apparently came standard with attraction. He was grotesquely unprepared. He had no model for this, no instruction manual, no schematic to follow. What he did have was pattern recognition and obsessive attention to detail. If he couldn't trust his own emotional literacy, maybe he could observe Nancy's. Watch for signs of interest or disinterest. Collect data. Make an informed decision based on evidence rather than feeling. It was a terrible plan. Gary knew it was terrible even as he committed to it. But it was the only plan he had. The experience Gary is undergoing mirrors limerence, a psychological state characterized by intrusive thinking, emotional dependency, and fear of rejection. Coined by psychologist Dorothy Tenev in 1979, limerence differs from love through its obsessive quality and acute sensitivity to reciprocation signals. For individuals with limited romantic experience, especially those neurodivergent, the intensity can feel destabilizing, a complete system disruption rather than gradual integration. Over the next week, Gary became a spy in his own house. He started leaving his workshop more frequently, inventing reasons to pass through common areas when he knew Nancy would be there. He observed her the way he'd observe a complex mechanism, looking for patterns, for signs, for any indication of her internal state. What he learned both frustrated and fascinated him. Nancy was extraordinarily self-contained. She moved through her routines with unwavering consistency: morning run, household tasks, afternoon studying, evening meal preparation, video calls home on Sunday. She was friendly but never familiar. Professional but not cold. She maintained the exact distance she'd established on day one, and Gary couldn't tell if it was preference or protection. He did notice that she'd started leaving small changes around the house. A plant on the kitchen windowsill that definitely hadn't been there before. A different arrangement of the sitting room furniture that actually improved the flow of space. Books appearing on shelves in the library, medical texts in Korean. their spines still crisp and uncracked, like she'd bought them new and was working through them methodically. One evening, Gary found her in the library, cross-legged on the floor with books spread around her in organized chaos, muttering to herself in Korean while she took notes. "You're studying medicine," he said from the doorway, and Nancy looked up, startled. "Trying to," she said. "I was in nursing school in Lagos. I had a placement here in Seoul, part of an exchange program, but there was an error with my paperwork. By the time it was resolved, I'd lost my spot." She gestured at the books. "I'm trying to test for certification here instead, but the medical terminology is..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Why didn't you go back to Lagos?" Nancy was quiet for a moment. "Pride, maybe. I told my family I was coming here to build something. Going back felt like admitting failure." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Also, jobs like this one pay better than anything I could get back home right now. I'm sending money back to help my younger brother with university. So I'm stuck being a housekeeper when I should be a nurse, studying at night and hoping I can pass an exam in a language I'm still learning." Gary felt something crack in his chest. She was overqualified for this job. Wildly overqualified. And she was here because of bureaucracy and family obligation and a series of circumstances that had nothing to do with choice. "You're not stuck," Gary said. "You're strategizing." Nancy looked at him, surprised. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's an accurate one. You identified an obstacle, assessed your resources, and you're executing a plan. That's strategy, not stuckness." Something shifted in Nancy's expression, a softening around her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Most people just tell me I should go home if I'm not happy. Most people are idiots." Nancy laughed, real and unexpected, and Gary felt the sound lodge somewhere behind his ribs. He wanted to hear it again. He wanted to be the reason for it. "Can I help?" The words were out before he could stop them. "Help how?" "I don't know medical terminology, but I'm good at memorization and pattern recognition. If you need someone to quiz you," or Gary stopped, aware he was overstepping, moving beyond the boundaries they'd established. "Never mind. That was inappropriate." "It wasn't," Nancy said quickly. "It was kind. I just don't want to add to your obligations. You already work too much. It wouldn't be an obligation." Their eyes met, and for a moment something unspoken hung in the air between them, fragile and significant. Then Nancy's phone buzzed with a reminder, and the moment broke. "I should get back to this," she said, gesturing at her books. "But thank you, Gary." "Really?" Gary nodded and left, his heart doing something complicated and arrhythmic in his chest. The next afternoon, he left a stack of index cards outside her door with a note. Write terms on one side, definitions on the other. Leave them outside the workshop when you're ready to be quizzed. The cards appeared 3 days later. They developed a new routine. Nancy would leave the cards, and in the evenings, Gary would emerge from his workshop and find her in the library or the kitchen. He'd quiz her, his flat monotone somehow perfect for the clinical terminology, and she'd answer, her confidence growing with each session. She was brilliant, he realized. Quick and precise and determined. She'd have made an exceptional nurse. She would make an exceptional nurse. "Why watchmaking?" Nancy asked one evening after they'd gone through 200 cards without a single mistake on her part. The question caught Gary off guard. People rarely asked him about his work, and when they did, it was usually about money or prestige, not motivation. "I like things that make sense," he said finally. A watch is a closed system. Every component has a specific purpose. If something's wrong, there's a logical reason, and if you're patient enough, you can fix it. There's no ambiguity. Unlike people. "Unlike people," Gary agreed. Nancy was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression he couldn't read. "Do you think people can be understood? The way you understand watches?" "I don't know. I've never been good at it." "You're better than you think." She hesitated, then added, "You noticed I was studying before I told you. You knew I run in the mornings even though we've never talked about it. You remember how I take my tea. Those aren't the observations of someone who doesn't understand people." Gary felt heat creep up his neck. "That's just pattern recognition." "That's caring," Nancy corrected gently. "You pay attention to people you care about." You just do it differently than most people expect. The word caring sent Gary's thoughts spiraling. Did he care about Nancy? Obviously. She was competent and respectful, and she made his house feel less like a fortress and more like a home. But was that caring in the way she meant? The way that mattered? I should get back to work, Gary said abruptly, standing. He needed distance, needed to think, needed to not be sitting across from Nancy while she looked at him like he was someone worth understanding. If Nancy was hurt by the sudden departure, she didn't show it. She just nodded and gathered her cards. Thank you for the help. Gary fled to his workshop and didn't emerge for 2 days. It became a pattern. Moments of connection followed by Gary's retreat. He couldn't help himself. Every time they talked, really talked, he felt the distance between them shrinking, and it terrified him. He didn't know how to exist in that smaller space. He didn't know what Nancy expected, what she wanted, whether the warmth in her voice when she thanked him meant anything beyond gratitude for a helpful employer. The neighborhood scrutiny didn't help. Now that Nancy had been seen in what Mrs. Park had apparently described as royal African garments, the rumors had evolved. She wasn't a victim anymore. Now she was a femme fatale, a con artist, possibly a princess in exile who'd seduced the reclusive mafia boss. The stories were ridiculous, but they led to more police visits, more suspicious stares when Nancy went to the market, more whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Gary watched it happening and felt rage, an emotion he rarely let himself feel. Nancy handled it with grace and patience he didn't possess, but he could see the toll. She smiled less, stayed inside more, started wearing sunglasses even on cloudy days, like she could hide from the attention. I should do something, Gary said one evening, cornering Nancy in the kitchen after she'd returned from another trip to the market where, based on her tense shoulders, something unpleasant had happened. Like what? I don't know. Make a statement. Tell people the truth. Nancy laughed, but it was bitter. The truth is boring. They don't want to hear that you're a watchmaker and I'm your housekeeper. They want drama. Mystery. Something to gossip about. She set down the groceries she'd been unpacking with more force than necessary. Besides, do you really want everyone knowing your business? You built these walls for a reason. She was right. Gary valued his privacy, had cultivated the myth precisely because it kept people away. But the cost of that myth was falling on Nancy, and that felt unbearable. I'm sorry, he said. It's not your fault people are racist and bored. It feels like my fault. Nancy turned to look at him fully. Gary, I chose to stay. I knew what I was signing up for. I've dealt with worse than neighborhood gossip. What could be worse than this? Try being a black nursing student in a Lagos hospital where half the senior staff think women shouldn't be in medicine. Try navigating immigration bureaucracy that treats your paperwork like a joke. Try calling your mother and hearing the disappointment in her voice when you explain you're cleaning houses instead of healing patients. Nancy's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she turned away quickly, but not before Gary saw the shine in her eyes. He wanted to comfort her. Had no idea how. Touching people wasn't something he did, and words felt inadequate, and he stood there frozen while Nancy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a shaky breath. I'm sorry, she said. That was unprofessional. It was honest, Gary said. You don't have to apologize for being honest. Nancy nodded, but didn't turn around. Gary stood there for another moment, useless and aching, then did the only thing he could think of. He finished unpacking the groceries, putting everything away in the precise locations Nancy had established, working in silence while she composed herself. When he was done, he said quietly, "You're going to be an excellent nurse. And anyone who can't see that is an idiot." Then he left before she could respond, his heart hammering, aware that he'd crossed another line, offered another piece of himself he couldn't take back. That night, Nancy left a note under his workshop door. Thank you for seeing me. Gary kept it in his pocket for 3 days, unfolding and refolding it until the paper grew soft, like something precious and fragile that needed protection. Summer deepened into monsoon season. Rain hammered the estate for days at a time, turning the gardens into small lakes and the world beyond the walls into gray static. Gary found himself leaving his workshop more often, drawn by the sound of Nancy moving through the house, the small noises that meant he wasn't alone. They'd settled into something that felt like friendship, though Gary had no previous friendships to compare it to. They quizzed medical terminology. They ate meals together sometimes, when Gary's focus broke long enough to remember food. They existed in the same spaces with an ease that should have felt impossible given Gary's need for solitude, but Nancy had somehow learned to be present without being intrusive, to share space without demanding interaction. It was comfortable. Safe. Gary told himself it was enough. Then came the night of the storm. The power went out at midnight. Gary was in his workshop, working by the light of his magnification lamp, when everything went dark. Emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, but it was dim, inadequate for detail work. He sat back with a sigh, knowing he'd have to stop for the night. Then he heard the crash. Gary was moving before conscious thought caught up, out of the workshop and through the dark house, following the sound. He found Nancy in the library, standing amid scattered books, her phone's flashlight illuminating her face from below in harsh angles. "I'm fine," she said immediately, seeing him. "Just startled. The lights went out and I knocked over a stack." But her voice was tight, and when lightning flashed outside, Gary saw her flinch. "You don't like storms," he said. Not a question. Nancy laughed, but it sounded forced. "I don't like the dark. Storms just come with it." Another flash of lightning, another flinch. "It's stupid. I'm an adult. Fear isn't logical. If it was, I wouldn't be afraid of crowds." Nancy looked at him, surprised. "You're afraid of crowds?" "Terrified. Too many people, too much stimulation, too many variables I can't control. It's not rational, but that doesn't make it less real." Gary hesitated. "Do you want company?" He expected her to say no. To maintain her careful independence, to retreat to her room and handle this alone the way she handled everything. Instead, she nodded. "Please." They ended up in the sitting room, the same room where Gary had seen her in the golden dress 3 months ago. Nancy sat on the sofa with her knees drawn up, and Gary sat in the armchair at what he calculated was a comfortable distance, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd. He'd brought candles from the workshop, and their light created small pockets of warmth against the dark. "When I was 8, Nancy said suddenly, there was a storm in Lagos. A bad one. The power went out, and our house flooded. I remember sitting in the dark, listening to the water coming in, and my father trying to move everything valuable to higher ground." She was quiet for a moment. "The water came up to my chest. I couldn't see anything, could barely breathe, and I just remember thinking this is how I die. In the dark, drowning, and no one will even see it happen." "But you didn't die." "Obviously not. My father got us out. We stayed with relatives for weeks while the house was repaired. But I've been afraid of the dark ever since." She smiled faintly. "Ironic, considering my skin tone. People make jokes. How can you be afraid of the dark when you are the dark? Like it's funny." Gary felt anger spike through him, sharp and protective. "People are idiots. You said that before." "It's consistently true." Nancy laughed, and some of the tension left her shoulders. Thunder rolled overhead, and she tensed again but didn't flinch. "Tell me about watches," she said. "Distract me." So Gary did. He talked about the history of timekeeping, about the evolution from sundials to water clocks to mechanical movements. He explained escapements and balance wheels, the difference between manual and automatic winding, the particular genius of the tourbillon. He talked about the watches he'd restored, the stories they carried, the way you could read a person's life in the wear patterns on a well-loved timepiece. Nancy listened, asking occasional questions, her body gradually relaxing as his words filled the space where fear had been. The storm raged outside, but inside was just Gary's voice and the candlelight and the particular intimacy of two people weathering something difficult together. "You love it," Nancy said during a pause. "Not just like it. Love it." "I suppose I do. I can hear it. Your voice changes when you talk about your work. Get softer. More." She searched for the word. "More alive." Gary didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought about how he sounded, had assumed his monotone was invariant. The idea that Nancy could hear emotion in his voice when he couldn't hear it himself felt exposing. You do the same thing, he said. When you talk about nursing, about helping people, your whole face changes. Voice prosody, the rhythm, stress, and intonation of speech carries emotional information often more reliably than words themselves. For neurodivergent individuals who may struggle with conventional emotional expression, prosody can betray genuine feeling even when facial expressions or explicit statements do not. Nancy's observation reflects her growing attunement to Gary's specific communication style, demonstrating the adaptive learning that occurs in cross-neurotype relationships. They sat in silence for a while, not uncomfortable. The storm was passing, the intervals between lightning and thunder growing longer. Gary watched Nancy in the candlelight and thought about courage. She'd left everything familiar, crossed an ocean, endured bureaucratic nightmares and neighborhood harassment, and the daily microaggressions of being visibly different in a homogeneous society, and she'd done it alone. She was the bravest person he'd ever met, and she thought she was a coward because she was afraid of the dark. Nancy, Gary said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. I need to tell you something. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting candlelight. Okay. Gary's carefully rehearsed words evaporated. He'd planned this, late at night in his workshop, had mapped out exactly what to say and how to say it. But sitting here in the aftermath of her vulnerability, with her looking at him like he was someone who mattered, all his calculations felt hollow. I'm not good at this, he said instead. At people. At feelings. I've spent my whole life not understanding how any of it works, and I've been fine with that. Preferred it, actually. But then you came here, and you didn't treat me like I was dangerous or broken or something that needed fixing. You just treated me like a person who happened to be different, and that was. He stopped, searching for words. That was the first time anyone had done that. And I thought I could just appreciate it and maintain distance, and everything would be fine. Nancy was very still, watching him with an intensity that should have made him uncomfortable, but didn't. But then I saw you in that dress, Gary continued, and everything I thought I understood about myself turned out to be wrong. I'm not incapable of attraction. I'm not broken in that way. I just hadn't met you yet. He forced himself to meet her eyes. I'm attracted to you, Nancy. I think about you constantly. I notice everything about you. I've been trying to be professional and appropriate, but I'm failing badly, and I needed you to know. Even if it means you leave. Even if I've ruined this. You deserved honesty. The silence that followed felt infinite. Gary could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the particular anxiety of having said something irrevocable. Nancy could reject him now. Could tell him he'd made everything awkward, that she'd have to quit, that this was exactly why workplace relationships were a terrible idea. Instead, she started laughing. It wasn't mocking laughter. It was relief and surprise and something that sounded almost like joy, and Gary didn't understand it at all. I'm sorry, Nancy said, seeing his confusion. I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing because I've been driving myself crazy for 2 months trying to figure out if you felt anything or if I was just projecting. Gary's brain stuttered to a halt. You, what? Gary, I've been attracted to you since approximately week 3. Maybe earlier. I couldn't tell if you even saw me as a person or just as the house manager. She shook her head. You're so careful about distance, so controlled, and I thought that meant you wanted me to stay professional. I thought if I crossed that line, you'd shut down completely. I thought the same thing about you. We're idiots, Nancy said, but she was smiling. Consistent with my previous observations about people, Gary said, and Nancy laughed again, and something that had been wound tight in Gary's chest for months finally loosened. So, Nancy said carefully, what do we do now? It was a fair question. Gary had spent weeks thinking about this moment, but he'd been so focused on the confession that he hadn't planned past it. What did people do when attraction was mutual? He had no framework, no experience, no idea what was expected. I don't know, Gary admitted. I've never done this before. Neither have I. Not really. Nancy pulled her knees closer to her chest. I dated in university, but nothing serious. Nothing that survived me leaving Nigeria. And since I've been here, I've been so focused on survival and studying that I haven't had time for anything else. She paused. But I'd like to try. If you would. Try what, specifically? Nancy's smile was gentle, like she understood he needed concrete terms. Dating. Getting to know each other outside of employer and employee. Seeing if this thing between us is real or just proximity and loneliness. It's real, Gary said with absolute certainty. At least on my side. On mine too. But we should still take it slow. Figure out how this works for us. She hesitated. I don't want to lose my job if this doesn't work out. I need the stability while I'm studying. You won't lose your job. Regardless of what happens between us, you'll always have a place here. Gary meant it. The thought of Nancy leaving, of the house returning to the empty silence it had been before her, was unbearable. But I agree about going slow. I don't know what I'm doing. Neither do I. We'll figure it out together. The power came back on with a hum and a flicker, the lights suddenly too bright after the candlelight. They both blinked against it, and the moment shifted, became less suspended and more real. Nancy stood, stretching, and Gary stood too, uncertain of protocol. Did they hug? Shake hands? He had no idea. Nancy solved the problem by stepping forward and touching his arm lightly. Thank you, she said. For being honest. For being brave. I wasn't brave. I was terrified. Bravery is being terrified and doing it anyway. She squeezed his arm once, then let go. I should sleep. We both should. But tomorrow, maybe we could have dinner together? Actually together, not you eating in the workshop. I'd like that. Nancy smiled and left, and Gary stood in the sitting room surrounded by candle wax and the lingering smell of rain, feeling like his entire life had just reorganized itself around a new axis. Dating Nancy was both easier and harder than Gary had anticipated. Easier because they already knew each other's rhythms, already existed comfortably in the same space. Harder because Gary had to consciously do things he'd never done before, had to learn a new language of affection and connection. They started with meals together, dinner every evening where they'd talk about their days. Nancy would tell him about her studying, about the frustrations of medical terminology and the small victories when concepts clicked. Gary would talk about whatever piece he was working on, and Nancy would listen with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was paying attention even when he got lost in technical details. Then came the casual touches. Nancy was naturally affectionate in ways Gary wasn't, and she'd rest her hand on his shoulder when she passed, or brush against him when they were in the kitchen together. Each touch sent electricity through Gary's nervous system, not unpleasant but intense, like his body was learning a new way to process input. Tell me if it's too much, Nancy said one evening, noticing him stiffen when she'd tucked a strand of hair behind his ear. I don't want to overwhelm you. It's not too much. Just different. I need time to adjust. Take all the time you need. Gary appreciated her patience more than he could articulate. She never pushed, never demanded more than he could give, but she also didn't retreat. She maintained gentle, consistent affection, letting him acclimate at his own pace. The neighborhood noticed, of course. Gary and Nancy taking walks around the estate together, visible through the gates. Nancy smiling more, relaxed in ways she hadn't been before. The rumors evolved again. Now they weren't boss and employee or criminal and victim. Now they were lovers, which was both accurate and insufficient to describe what they were building. Mrs. Park knocked on the gate one afternoon, ostensibly to deliver misdelivered mail, actually to interrogate. Gary answered the intercom himself, something he never did. Is it true? Mrs. Park asked boldly. You and the African girl? Gary felt Nancy tense beside him. They'd discuss this, how to handle the inevitable questions. Nancy had wanted to ignore it, to let people think whatever they wanted. But Gary was tired of myths and misconceptions, tired of letting other people's assumptions dictate his life. Her name is Nancy, Gary said clearly. And yes, we're together. Is that a problem? Mrs. Park sputtered. People are concerned. People should mind their own business. Was there anything else? He ended the call before she could respond, and Nancy stared at him with wide eyes. That was very direct. I'm tired of being indirect. They can think whatever they want, but they'll know the truth. Gary paused. Unless you didn't want me to say anything? No, Nancy smiled, and it was brilliant. That was perfect. Thank you for defending me. Always, Gary said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised them both. Months passed. Summer faded into autumn. Nancy passed her medical terminology exam with near-perfect scores, and Gary took her to dinner to celebrate, an actual restaurant where they sat across from each other and navigated the social complexity of a public date. It was exhausting and awkward, and Gary loved every minute of it because Nancy was there, laughing at his observations about other diners, patient when he had to take breaks from the noise and stimulation. They kissed for the first time in the estate gardens, surrounded by chrysanthemums turning gold in the October light. It was tentative and careful, Gary hyper-aware of every point of contact, Nancy giving him space to retreat if he needed it. He didn't need it. He leaned into the kiss, into her, and felt something in his chest expand with a warmth he'd never experienced before. "Okay," Nancy whispered when they parted. "More than okay." They took their time with physical intimacy, both of them learning what worked and what didn't, communicating with the same directness they brought to everything else. Gary learned that Nancy liked having her neck kissed, that she was ticklish on her left side, that she made small contented sounds when he ran his fingers through her hair. Nancy learned that Gary needed warning before being touched, that he preferred dim lighting, that too much sensation at once could overwhelm him into shutdown. It was a collaboration, an ongoing negotiation, and it worked because they both approached it with respect and curiosity rather than expectation. Intercultural relationships require continuous cultural translation and negotiation of differing norms around communication, affection, family obligation, and identity. For Gary and Nancy, this is compounded by neurodivergence and the racialized experience of being visibly other in soul. Research shows such relationships succeed through explicit communication, mutual respect, and willingness to hold space for discomfort while building shared meaning. Winter arrived with the first snow, turning the estate into something from a traditional painting. Nancy had never seen snow before, and Gary watched her experience it with a joy that was almost childlike, catching flakes on her tongue and making a small, lopsided snowman in the garden. "This is magic," she said, spinning in the falling snow. "I can't believe people who grow up with this take it for granted." "I took it for granted," Gary admitted. Until now. He was learning to see the world through Nancy's eyes, to notice beauty and wonder in things he dismissed as mundane. She made everything feel new, and in return, he gave her stability and understanding, a safe space to pursue her dreams while recovering from the disappointments that had brought her here. They never defined their relationship in conventional terms. Nancy still managed the estate, though they'd hired additional help so she could focus more on her studies. Gary still spent most of his time in his workshop, but now he emerged regularly, seeking Nancy out, sharing his space with her in ways he'd never imagined possible. In February, almost a year after Nancy had arrived, she received her nursing certification. She'd passed every exam, completed every requirement, and she was officially qualified to practice in South Korea. Gary took her to the same restaurant where they'd had their first date, and this time when she cried, it was from joy. "I did it," she said, wiping her eyes. "I actually did it." "You did it," Gary confirmed. "You're brilliant and determined, and you deserve this. I couldn't have done it without you." The quizzing, the support, just having someone who believed in me. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Thank you." Gary laced his fingers through hers, marveling as he always did at the contrast of their skin, the way her hand fit perfectly in his. "What happens now?" It was the question they'd been avoiding. Nancy had a certification now. She could get a job at any hospital in Seoul, could move out of the estate, could build the life she'd come here for. Gary would support her, whatever she chose, but the thought of her leaving made his chest tight with panic. "I've been thinking about that," Nancy said carefully. "I have some options. There's a hospital in Gangnam that's interested, and a clinic in Itaewon that serves expat communities." She paused. "But I don't want to leave the estate. I don't want to leave you." Relief flooded through Gary so intensely he had to take a breath. "You don't have to leave. I know. But I also don't want to just be your estate manager who happens to have a nursing degree. I want to use my skills, Gary. I worked too hard not to. So use them. Open a private practice in one of the estate buildings. We have space. You could serve the neighborhood, the expat community, whoever needs care. The idea formed as he spoke, gaining clarity. I could fund it. Cover the setup costs, the equipment, whatever you need. Nancy stared at him. Gary, that's too much. It's an investment. In you, in your future, in us. He squeezed her hand. I have more money than I know what to do with, and I want to do something meaningful with it. What's more meaningful than helping you achieve your dreams? You're serious. Completely. Nancy's eyes filled with tears again, and she laughed through them. You're going to make me cry in this restaurant twice in one night. Is that a yes? It's a yes. God, Gary, it's absolutely a yes. They planned it together over the following months. Nancy designed the practice, a small clinic in one of the estate's auxiliary buildings, set up to serve patients who needed affordable, quality care. Gary handled the logistics, the permits, the renovations, approaching it with the same precision he brought to watch restoration. It was a collaboration, each of them contributing their strengths, building something that was theirs together. The clinic opened in May, and Nancy's first patient was Mrs. Park from down the street, who'd fallen and needed her wrist examined. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. I suppose I owe you an apology, Mrs. Park said stiffly, while Nancy wrapped her wrist with gentle competence. I made assumptions. They were unkind. Yes, they were, Nancy agreed, not unkindly. But you're here now, and I'm going to take care of you. That's what matters. Word spread. Nancy was professional, compassionate, and spoke enough Korean now to communicate effectively with her patients. The clinic stayed busy, serving not just the neighborhood, but the growing expat community in Seoul, people who needed medical care from someone who understood what it was like to navigate a foreign healthcare system. Gary watched her thrive and felt pride so intense it was almost painful. She'd taken every obstacle life had thrown at her and turned it into something meaningful. She was extraordinary, and somehow, impossibly, she'd chosen him. One evening in late summer, almost 2 years after Nancy had first arrived, they sat in the garden watching the sunset. Nancy leaned against Gary's shoulder, comfortable in a way that had taken months to develop, and Gary wrapped his arm around her, the gesture now familiar instead of foreign. Do you ever regret it? Nancy asked quietly. The quiet life you had before me? Never, Gary said immediately. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Even though I disrupted everything, changed all your routines. Especially because of that. Gary turned to look at her, at the way the fading light caught her skin and turned it to amber. I thought I wanted solitude. I thought I was happy alone. But I was just existing, Nancy. Not living. You taught me the difference. Nancy smiled and kissed him, soft and sweet, and Gary kissed her back, still marveling that he got to do this, that she wanted him to. I love you, Nancy said against his lips. I know we don't say it often, but I do. Completely. I love you too, Gary said, the words still feeling new and important every time he used them. I forgot how to breathe when I first saw you. And then you taught me how to do it again, properly, with purpose. That's very romantic for someone who claims not to understand romance. I understand it now. You're an excellent teacher. They sat in the garden until the stars came out, until the night air grew cool and Nancy shivered slightly. Gary pulled her closer, and she settled against him with a contented sigh, and somewhere in the house behind them, watches ticked in perfect synchrony, marking time in a life that had become more than Gary had ever imagined possible. He'd spent 32 years building walls, maintaining distance, protecting himself from a world that didn't understand him. And then Nancy had walked through his gates with her practical efficiency and her quiet strength and her complete lack of fear, and she'd dismantled every defense he had without even trying. She'd seen him. Not the myth, not the diagnosis, not the awkward man who didn't fit conventional templates. Just him. Gary. And she decided he was worth staying for, worth building a life with, worth loving. In his workshop, the minute repeater he'd been working on the day everything changed sat completed, its chimes perfect and clear. Gary had given it to Nancy as a gift, and she laughed and said she didn't need a watch to tell her when she was happy. But she wore it anyway, on special occasions, and sometimes Gary would catch her checking it and smiling, like the time it marked meant something more than hours and minutes. The neighborhood had adjusted. Some people still whispered, still found their relationship unusual or scandalous, but most had moved on to newer gossip. Mrs. Park had become one of Nancy's regular patients and biggest supporters, having apparently decided that redemption lay in enthusiastic overcorrection. The police hadn't visited in over a year. Gary's work continued. He still spent long hours in his workshop, still lost himself in the meditation of tiny gears and springs. But now he emerged regularly, seeking Nancy out, sharing meals and conversation and the quiet intimacy of existing together. His watches were still perfect, still impossible, but they no longer consumed him entirely. Nancy's clinic thrived. She was building a reputation, earning respect in the medical community, making a real difference in people's lives. She still sent money home to her family, but now it came from her own practice, her own skills, and the pride in her voice when she talked to her mother had returned. They were building something together, brick by brick, moment by moment. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. It was better. "Tell me about your day," Nancy said that evening, as they prepared dinner together in the kitchen, a routine they developed over months of collaboration. Gary told her about the pocket watch he was working on, a commission from a collector in Tokyo, explaining the particular challenge of a damaged fusee chain. Nancy listened, asking questions, her hands moving through the familiar motions of chopping vegetables while Gary handled the rice. It was domestic and ordinary and completely extraordinary, and Gary felt grateful for every moment of it. Later, in bed, Nancy curled against him in the darkness that she no longer feared as long as he was there. Gary ran his fingers through her hair, feeling the texture of it, the warmth of her skin against his. "Gary." Nancy's voice was soft, sleep-blurred. Do you think we would have found each other if circumstances had been different? If I hadn't needed a job, if you hadn't needed a house manager?" Gary thought about it. About all the variables that had to align perfectly for them to be here, in this moment. The bureaucratic error that had cost Nancy her placement. Mrs. Cho's retirement. The myths and walls that had kept everyone else away but somehow let Nancy through. "I don't know," he said honestly. Maybe in another life, we would have met in a hospital, or a watch shop, or on a random street corner. Maybe we were always meant to find each other." "You don't believe in fate." "I didn't. I'm reconsidering." Nancy laughed quietly and pressed a kiss to his shoulder. "I'm glad we found each other in this life, whatever the reason. I'm glad you forgot how to breathe." "So am I," Gary said, and meant it with every gear and spring of his recalibrated heart. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle and steady. Nancy tensed for just a moment, then relaxed, safe in the circle of Gary's arms. The darkness held no fear when you weren't alone in it. And Gary held her close, this woman who'd walked into his fortress and turned it into a home, and knew that he would spend the rest of his life learning new ways to breathe, as long as she was there to teach him.